Welcome to Creepy, the best horror storyteller on YouTube.
Part 1.
I never believed in ghosts or demons until I met the smiling man. He was the most terrifying thing I ever saw in my life, and I still have nightmares about him. He was the reason I moved out of my apartment in downtown Chicago, and the reason I never walk alone at night. It all started on a cold winter evening when I was returning home from work. I was a journalist for a local newspaper, and I had just finished covering a story about a series of murders that had been plaguing the city. The police had no leads, no suspects, no motives. The only thing they knew was that the victims were all found with a twisted smile on their faces, as if they had died of laughter. I was walking along the sidewalk, feeling uneasy and paranoid. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. The streets were deserted, except for a few cars passing by. The wind was howling, and the snow was falling. I pulled my coat tighter around me and quickened my pace. I was almost at my apartment building when I saw him. He was standing on the opposite side of the street, under a dim streetlight. He was wearing a black suit and a black hat, and he had a long, thin face. But what caught my attention was his smile. He was smiling so wide, it looked like his mouth was about to split open. His teeth were yellow and crooked, and his eyes were dark and hollow. He was staring right at me, and he didn't blink. I felt a chill run down my spine, and a surge of fear in my chest. I had never seen anyone like him before, and I hoped I would never see him again. I crossed the street and tried to ignore him. I hoped he was just some crazy homeless guy, or a prankster trying to scare people. I hoped he would leave me alone. But he didn't. As soon as I reached the other side of the street, he started to follow me. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, never taking his eyes off me. He kept smiling, as if he knew something I didn't. He kept getting closer and closer, until he was only a few feet behind me. I panicked, and ran towards my apartment building. I fumbled with my keys, and opened the door. I slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. I breathed a sigh of relief, and looked through the peephole. He was still there, standing in front of the door. He was still smiling, and he raised his hand. He knocked on the door, softly, 3 times. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, and I backed away from the door. I grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. I hoped they would come soon, and save me from this nightmare. I hoped they would catch him, and lock him up. I hoped he would stop smiling, and leave me alone. But he didn't. He kept knocking on the door, softly, 3 times. He kept smiling, and he kept staring. He kept waiting for me to open the door.
Part 2.
I waited for the police to arrive, but they never did. I waited for the smiling man to go away, but he never did. He kept knocking on the door, softly, 3 times. He kept smiling, and he kept staring. He kept waiting for me to open the door. I tried to call 911 again, but the line was busy. I tried to call my friends, my family, anyone who could help me, but no one answered. I tried to access the internet, but there was no connection. I felt like I was trapped, alone, with no way out. I wondered who he was and what he wanted. I wondered if he was the killer behind the murders, and if I was his next target. I wondered if he was a ghost, or a demon, or something worse. I wondered if he was real, or if I was losing my mind. I decided to confront him and end this nightmare. I grabbed a kitchen knife and walked towards the door. I took a deep breath and opened it. He was still there, standing in front of me. He was still smiling, and he still didn't blink. He looked at me and spoke. His voice was low and raspy, and it sent shivers down my spine. "Hello, Jack," He said, "I've been looking for you." I felt a shock of recognition and a surge of horror. I knew him. I knew who he was. He was the smiling man. He was the killer. He was my brother. He had disappeared 5 years ago, after our parents died in a car accident. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had been in and out of mental hospitals. He had been obsessed with jokes and laughter and smiles. He had been tormented by voices and visions and nightmares. He had been my brother and I had loved him. But he was not my brother anymore. He was a monster and I hated him. He smiled wider and reached into his coat. He pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. "Let me tell you a joke, Jack," he said. "It's the funniest joke in the world. It's the joke that killed them all. It's the joke that will kill you." He pulled the trigger and I heard a loud bang. I felt a sharp pain in my chest and I fell to the ground. I looked at him and he looked at me. He was still smiling and he still didn't blink. He leaned over me and whispered in my ear, "The joke is, there is no joke." He laughed and I died.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more similar horror stories.